James Whale's 1931 movie version of Frankenstein was a huge hit at the time and turned Boris Karloff, who played the monster, into a star overnight. It follows the main events of the novel, i.e. Frankenstein creates a monster who goes on to kill and wreak havoc, but cuts Walton, the story of Felix and Safie, and Frankenstein's decision to build then destroy a female monster. Watching a film version can never substitute for a close reading and rereading of a text. That said, scrutinising changes made to key characters and relationships can help give fresh insight into an original text, and that is what I will aim to do in this video. Keen to consider anew the characters of Frankenstein and the monster whilst enjoying some violent, decadent, fair use, black and white clips from the original film? Stay tuned, this is Schofield on Shakespeare. A key change made to the original text is that this Frankenstein, rather confusingly named Henry Frankenstein, whilst Clerval is given the first name of Victor, is nowhere near as isolated. He has an assistant, Fritz, and the two work feverishly and enthusiastically together to collect the requisite dead body parts during the macabre opening to the film. He therefore has someone with whom he can share his excitement as he draws near to being able to animate dead matter.
The storm will be magnificent. All the electrical secrets of heaven. And this time we're ready. Hey, Fritz? Ready.
With just 15 minutes to go before Frankenstein plans to harness the power of lightning to bring his creation to life, there is a tremendous knocking on the door of the disused windmill he has adapted as his laboratory within his hometown. Reluctantly, he's forced to admit his university professor, Dr. Waldman, along with his friend Clerval and fiancée Elizabeth. So, including Frankenstein himself, there are no fewer than 5 people present when the monster is finally brought to life.
Look, it's moving. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive. Oh, in the name of God. Now I know what it feels like to be God. Oh.
So how does this compare to the original text? Well, Shelley emphasises the unhealthy solitariness of Frankenstein's time spent investigating the nature of life, whilst prodding and collecting dead bodies. Based in Ingolstadt, hundreds of miles away from his family, he completely ignores his father's letters and has virtually no human contacts as he goes through the process of collecting bones from charnel houses and disturbing with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. This leaves Frankenstein with a horrible moral quandary once his monster has been born. Should he tell others, particularly his loved ones, and therefore potentially give them a greater chance of being able to defend themselves in the future, as well as an explanation for, on the surface, his disturbed, erratic behaviour? He decides to keep it secret for 2 reasons. Firstly, he fears that people won't believe him and simply dismiss him as a lunatic. Secondly, he doesn't want to burden others with such horrific knowledge. Yet the net effect of such secrecy is that the monster is fairly easily able to elude and to murder the likes of William, Clerval and Elizabeth. They had no idea whatsoever about his existence. This is not the case in Whale's 1931 film. both Clerval and Elizabeth were present at the monster's inception. And so, for example, when Elizabeth is left alone in her bedroom on her wedding night, as Frankenstein and Clerval hunt desperately for the monster, at least she is aware of the potential for danger, even if she was previously under the illusion that the monster, sedated, would be humanely disposed of by Dr. Waldman. But more importantly, the presence of Dr. Waldman, Elizabeth and Clerval at the birth of the monster helps them identify and empathise with Frankenstein's inner torment and sufferings. Witnessing such a momentous event binds them all together as a team. There are those who know about the monster and what he is capable of against those who don't, unlike in Shelley's novel, where it is Victor Frankenstein versus the rest of the world. And this in turn paves the way towards Frankenstein being a far more attractive character than in Shelley's novel. He is not an obsessive, isolated egomaniac, but rather someone who can share the details of his passions with others, and crucially, someone who can empathise. In Shelley's novel, you get the impression that Frankenstein is simply so crushed and overburdened by the secret of what he has done and what he needs to do, i.e. initially create a female monster and then subsequently try to hunt down his creation, that he has no capacity for genuine love and empathy for anyone other than himself. In contrast, in Whale's film, even after the monster has killed his assistant Fritz, he shows a degree of compassion which is entirely missing in the novel.
He hated Fritz. Fritz always tormented him. Come, pull yourselves together. Well, what can we do? Kill it, as you would any savage animal. We must overpower him first. Get me a hypodermic needle. It's murder. It's our only chance. In a few minutes he'll be through that door. Come, quick, hurry.
In this clip, Frankenstein tries to justify to some extent the monster's killing, pointing out that Fritz always tormented him. And when Dr. Waldman states that they should kill the monster like any other savage monster, he looks away and shakes his head vigorously. It is clear that he views such an act as morally wrong. Indeed, unlike in Shelley's novel, Frankenstein's early interactions with the monster in the film suggests that he does accept that he has some responsibility for its development and well-being, even if it may be triggered primarily by scientific rather than quasi-parental zeal.
Come in. Come in. Sit down. Sit down. You see, it understands.
In this clip, Frankenstein asks and beckons the creature to come and join him in the room with Dr. Waldman. His repetition of "sit down" is aimed at testing whether the creature might be able to understand and respond to simple language. Whilst it is notable that, in his enthusiasm for learning more about his discovery, he is prepared to be in very close proximity. What a sharp contrast to the Frankenstein in Shelley's novel, who is so repulsed by his newly animated creature that he immediately rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. Even when he eventually returns to look again at his creature, he is unable to bring himself to say anything, and so he again escaped and rushed downstairs. Almost immediately, he brands the creature his enemy. And the effect of these differences? Well, a movie watcher returning to Shelley's novel is likely to be struck anew by the original Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's callousness and abdication of responsibility, of his failure to adhere to the very basics of human civility, e.g., to speak in a kind voice or to treat someone with some respect. We are also likely to scrutinise the fairness of his first-person narrative even more closely. For example, when he persists in labelling his own creation a monster, or when he declares that his creatures stretch out a hand seemingly to detain me, we may think back to the film, in which at least some basic courtesies were observed, and conclude that beneath his whole wretched narrative may lie a deeply unpleasant individual, worthy of contempt rather than the pity he seems to crave. Those returning to Shelley's text having watched Wales' 1931 film are likely to have another reason to judge Frankenstein in a harsher light. Namely, the monster in Shelley's text seems far worthier of love and respect compared to the tottering creature in the film. For instance, Boris Karloff, as the monster in the film, never learns to speak, thus meaning that he would never be capable of the kind of extraordinary, quasi-poetic eloquence which Shelley's monster emits in the Alps. Moreover, note that when the film monster meets a young child on her own, she is kind and welcoming.
Who are you? I'm Maria. Will you play with me? Would you like one of my flowers?
The kindness of this child is in sharp contrast to the lone, beautiful child the monster comes across around the outskirts of Geneva in Shelley's novel. Catching sight of him, the monster speculates that this little creature could be unprejudiced and has lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. This may be the case for the poor unfortunate girl in the film, but emphatically not for the boy in the novel, who turns out to be Frankenstein's younger brother William. Upon seeing him, he placed his hand before his eyes and uttered a shrill scream, "Let me go! Monster! Ugly wretch! You wish to eat me and tear me to pieces! You are an ogre!" Like his elder brother, William is unable to look beyond the monster's hideous appearance and makes an instinctive judgment that someone who is this gruesome on the outside must be similarly disgusting within. Of course, the monster goes on to kill William, and deliberately too, unlike the monster with the little girl in the film. He throws her into the lake as part of a game without realising that she could drown. Nonetheless, it is impossible not to feel a degree of sympathy for Shelley's monster, in spite of his murderous acts, especially when considering a comparative reading of Wales' film. Whereas Wales' monster is given at least some attention at the beginning of his life, Shelley's monster is neglected and hated from his very first second. Whereas Wales' monster does receive kindness from an unprejudiced child, Shelley's children are so prejudiced and they are as bigoted as their elders. And whereas Wales' inarticulate monster can only teeter and stumble about, usually with his arms in front of him, zombie-esque, Shelley's monster can cross impressively vast distance at epic speed, just like a superhero. And This monster has also learnt lessons from Milton. So the reader of Shelley's novel can't help but keep on wondering, now, how would the monster have turned out if Frankenstein had at least given him a chance of becoming good? An examination of the relationship between Frankenstein and his father in the novel and the film is also enlightening. In the film, there is clear detachment between the two. Like Shelley's parent, he is concerned that his son has been spending too much time working in his laboratory. Here he is in conversation with Clerval and Elizabeth.
Henry is well, but he's very busy. He said he would get in touch with you soon.
Don't worry about him, Baron. He'll be home in a few days.
You two have it all arranged, haven't you? You think I'm an idiot, don't you? But I'm not. Anyone can see with half an eye there's something wrong. And I've 2 eyes, pretty good ones at that. Well, what is it?
You're quite mistaken, Baron.
What's the matter with my son? What's he doing?
He's completing his experiments, that's all.
Why does he go messing around an old ruined windmill when he has a decent house, a bath, good food and drink, and a darn pretty girl to come back to? Will you tell me that?
Baron, you don't understand.
I understand perfectly well. There's another woman, and you're afraid to tell me. Pretty sort of experiments these must be.
Whereas Baron Frankenstein is right to be a little suspicious about his extended absence, he clearly has no respect for his son's scientific work, referring to it dismissively as messing around in an old, ruined windmill. He even concocts his own half-baked theory about what his son is actually doing by suggesting that he may be seeing another woman, which he describes sardonically as pretty sordid experiments. Frankenstein earlier seems to show some resentment towards his father. Here he is in earnest discussion with Dr. Waldman about the difference between his father and Elizabeth following the creation of his monster.
What think of Elizabeth, your father? Elizabeth believes in me. My father never believes in anyone.
Could therefore a lingering desire to prove his father wrong be one of the motivating factors behind Frankenstein's obsessive quest to create life in Wales film? His father never believes in anyone, he says, looking downwards. Well, perhaps the successful discovery of a ray which goes beyond the mere ultraviolet ray would be enough to get his father to abandon his cynicism and finally wholeheartedly embrace his son and his achievements. We can't help but sympathise a little with this Frankenstein, having to put up with such a bluff, undemonstrative, essentially unsupportive dad. A far cry indeed from the dad in Mary Shelley's novel. Shelley's Frankenstein Sr., clearly hurt by his son's extended silent absence, made no reproach in his letters and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations more particularly than before. Earlier on during his childhood, his parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence. And even following the deaths of William, Justine and Clerval, and even after hearing his ravings about his own murderous responsibility, Shelley's Frankenstein Sr. remains devoted to his son, telling him, "My dear Victor, do not speak thus. Heavy misfortunes have befallen us, but let us only cling closer to what remains and transfer our love for those whom we have lost to those who yet live. And when time shall have softened your despair, new and dear objects of care will be born to replace those of whom we have been so cruelly deprived." So once again, a comparative reading of the two texts, the novel and the film, hammers home Shelley's Frankenstein's unpalatable selfishness, even with a godlike, extraordinarily understanding father. Or perhaps because of it, he still ends up living a life in which he inflicts so much pain and suffering on others through his own willful actions. And how about Frankenstein's relationship with Elizabeth? How is that portrayed in the film? And how does this compare with Shelley's novel? Well, firstly, the film has no incestuous undertones. There is no suggestion that Elizabeth and Frankenstein have been brought up together virtually as brother and sister, as is the case in Shelley's novel, before being explicitly told by their mother on her deathbed that their marriage could bring a great deal of happiness to her dying self and their father. So without this background, the relationship in the film already seems healthier and less claustrophobic. The film even has the addition of a hint that Clerval may also be fruitlessly in love with Elizabeth. In the following clip, remember the film's confusing switch of first names. Victor is Clerval, not Frankenstein.
Victor, you're a dear.
You know I'd go to the ends of the earth for you.
I shouldn't like that. I'm far too fond of you.
I wish you were.
Victor.
I'm sorry.
This element of competition for the hand of Elizabeth seems healthy. The two are not just siblings eternally promised to each other from an absurdly young age, but live in the real world, in which the possibility of competing forces in the spheres of love is an everyday reality. Earlier on in this video, I mentioned the more significant role played by Dr. Waldman in the film. Following the monster's strangling of Frankenstein assistants, Fritz, and subsequent grappling with Frankenstein and Waldman himself, Frankenstein collapses. Waldman then takes charge, orders Frankenstein to go home to rest, and reassures him about the creature.
And I will see that it is painlessly destroyed. No. Yes, leave it all to me. Oh, poor Fritz. All my fault.
There, Henry, you can't do any more now. You must come home until you get well again. You'll soon feel better when you get out of here.
There are two key points I'd like to make about this scene and how it compares to Shelley's original text. Firstly, note that because Elizabeth knows about Frankenstein's creation, she is able to empathise deeply with him and care for him because she knows exactly what is troubling him. Secondly, Dr. Waldman, taking on the responsibility of the monster, takes an enormous burden off Frankenstein's shoulders, even if this is only temporary. We have already seen Dr. Waldman fail miserably in his efforts to painlessly destroy. Thus, it is no surprise that the relatively de-burdened Frankenstein is able to open up and express open, heartfelt feelings of love towards Elizabeth, which is never really seen in Shelley's novel. Here are the couple recuperating and enjoying each other's company within the beautiful gardens of Frankenstein's family home.
It's like heaven being with you again.
Heaven wasn't so far away all the time, you know.
I know, but I didn't realize it. My work, those horrible days and nights. I couldn't think of anything else.
Henry, you're not to think of those things anymore. You promised.
All right. Let's think about us. When will our wedding be?
Let's make it soon.
As soon as you like.
Here, Frankenstein opens up to Elizabeth and admits that his obsession with reanimating dead matter caused him to neglect far more important things, notably the heaven of his feelings and relationship with her. Compare this loving, mutually confiding exchange to Frankenstein's desperate siege mentality and Elizabeth's love tingled with melancholic unease in the run-up to their wedding in Mary Shelley's novel. As his extraordinary narrative comes to a close, Frankenstein tells Walton, "But on the day that was to fulfill my wishes and my destiny, she was melancholy, and a presentiment of evil pervaded her. And perhaps also she thought of the dreadful secret which I had promised to reveal to her on the following day." The latter made reference to an earlier letter which Frankenstein had written to Elizabeth, in which he alluded to strange past behaviour. "I will confide this tale of misery and terror to you the day after our marriage shall take place, for, my sweet cousin, there must be perfect confidence between us." What a splendid treat for the first full day of their honeymoon. A long anticipated tale of misery and terror. As a modern reader, what I find most telling about this is Frankenstein's extraordinary selfish presumption. He will only tell Elizabeth the appalling truth of his macabre creation and the subsequent consequences once she is chained eternally to him through the sacred institution of marriage. In other words, it simply doesn't occur to him that it might be fairer if he gave her this news before their marriage, which would at least have given her the opportunity to reconsider whether her devotion might be better directed elsewhere rather than towards an obsessive, morbid egomaniac. The relaxed exchange between Elizabeth and Frankenstein in the film emphasises what Frankenstein in Shelley's novel has sacrificed due to his unhallowed, secretive, solitary pursuits. The possibility of everyday domestic intimacy. What is particularly tragic in the novel is that when Frankenstein does finally open up, it is to a stranger, the scribing Walton. Their shared confidences will have no longer-term benefit to Frankenstein whatsoever, for he is now at a stage in his life in which relentless, futile pursuit of his creation has usurped any kind of positive human relationship. Watching Frankenstein and Elizabeth share intimate moments in the film makes me wonder how Shelley's Frankenstein's life could have been different if only he had chosen to direct the following words at Elizabeth rather than Walton. Learn from me how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier than man is who believes his native town to be the world's, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature would allow. For it is surely Frankenstein's stubborn insistence not to confide, having previously made the, with hindsight, disastrous decision to unhealthily hole himself up for 2 years in order to play with dead body parts, which contributes significantly to the subsequent fragmentation of his closest family and friends. Unlike Shelley's novel, the film has a happy ending, which I can't resist sharing with you. The monster does enter Elizabeth's bedroom on her wedding night, and he does find her alone.
Don't let it come here. Don't let it come here.
But crucially, she ends up having some kind of fit rather than dying. How does Frankenstein fare? Well, he ends up grappling with the monster within his disused Windmill cum forma scientific laboratory. Outside, the hordes are screaming, armed with torch fires.
Frankenstein! Frankenstein!
Bring him down to the village and let's take him home.
Frankenstein survives his 2-stage fall from the top of the windmill and ends the film in bed, being tended by Elizabeth. The chambermaids come up with the idea of fortifying their young master with some fine old wine.
We thought that Mr. Henry could do with a glass of his great-grandmother's wine.
Fine old lady, my grandmother. Very foreseeing of her to prevent my grandfather drinking this. Mr. Henry doesn't need this. Well, as I said before, I say again, here's to a son, to the house of Frankenstein.
The implication of Baron Frankenstein's words is clear. Frankenstein doesn't need wine to get him up to full fitness, but time alone with his beautiful young wife to have sex and procreate. Such natural, vigorous pursuits will return him to health, and the chambermaids dutifully giggle along in implicit agreement. The traditional, happy, heterosexual ending to this film makes me think again of the sexual dynamics between Elizabeth and Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's novel. In her novel, Frankenstein never once seems to look forward to the consummation of his relationship with Elizabeth. either too overburdened by his secret knowledge of the monster and his accursed vow, or too overwhelmed by the thought and pressure of first-time heterosexual sex, or both, depending on your interpretation. Instead, he dies hundreds of miles away from civilization, on a ship within a freezing sea, still entirely consumed by thoughts of his monster, and whether he, or now someone else, will ever be able to get him. In the life of her Frankenstein, Shelley shows how the ordinary joys of everyday domestic existence, which includes sex, can be obliterated following the selection of an apparently innocent yet all-consuming solitary quest for distinction in science and discoveries. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the transformation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and his monster within James Whale's 1931 movie. Many thanks for watching.